In 2020, geneticists analyzing the DNA of West African populations discovered something that should not exist. Deep within the human genome, buried among sequences that govern our most basic biological functions, they found fragments of DNA that do not match any known human lineage. Not Neanderthal, not Denisovan, not Homo erectus or any other hominin species we have discovered in the fossil record. This DNA comes from what scientists now call a ghost population, an entirely unknown intelligent species that interbred with the ancestors of modern West Africans between 40,000 and 100,000 years ago. The genetic signatures are undeniable. The interbreeding was extensive, and the implications are staggering. For decades, the narrative of human evolution has centered on Europe and Asia, where Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA in non-African populations was celebrated as evidence of complex human history. But when similar evidence emerged from Africa, revealing that the genetic story of the continent is far more complex and involves species we have not even identified yet, the response was silence. Why? Because acknowledging a ghost population in Africa would force science to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the African continent holds secrets about human origins that fundamentally challenge everything we thought we knew. And those secrets have been systematically ignored because they threaten the simplistic narrative that has kept Africa on the margins of the human story. The story of human evolution, as it has been taught for the past century, follows a clear and simple path. Modern humans evolved in Africa around 300,000 years ago, left the continent in a great migration around 60,000 years ago, and then interbred with archaic human species like Neanderthals and Denisovans as they spread across Europe and Asia. This narrative positions Africa as the cradle of humanity, but also as a place that was genetically isolated and homogeneous, a launchpad for human expansion, but not itself a site of complex evolutionary interactions. Non-African populations were presented as genetically diverse and interesting because they carried DNA from multiple hominin species. African populations were presented as genetically pure, as if the continent had been evolutionarily static for hundreds of thousands of years. This was not just bad science. It was ideologically convenient science. It allowed researchers to focus their attention, funding, and prestige on studying European and Asian populations while treating African genetics as a baseline, a control group, rather than as a rich and complex evolutionary story in its own right. But the ghost population discovery shattered this narrative completely. In 2020, a team led by geneticist Arun Durvasula analyzed the genomes of individuals from Nigeria and Sierra Leone and found clear statistical evidence of ancient interbreeding with an unknown hominin species. The DNA fragments were not random noise or sequencing errors. They showed the distinctive patterns of introgression, the technical term for genetic material introduced through interbreeding with another species. The ghost population contributed between 2 and 19% of the ancestry in some West African genomes, a level of admixture comparable to Neanderthal DNA in Europeans. Yet while Neanderthal admixture has been the subject of thousands of research papers, museum exhibitions, and popular documentaries, the ghost population was met with a few academic publications and then near total silence in mainstream science communication. The reason is clear. Acknowledging this discovery would require admitting that the genetic history of Africa is not simple or well understood, that there are entire species of intelligent hominins that lived, thrived, and interbred with human ancestors in Africa, and that we have not even begun to uncover the full story. It would require shifting resources, attention, and funding toward African genetics. And most dangerously, it would require confronting the reality that the marginalization of African science is not due to lack of interesting discoveries, but due to deliberate lack of interest in what those discoveries reveal. The ghost population was not discovered through fossil excavation. It was discovered through statistical genetics, the analysis of DNA sequences to detect patterns that indicate ancient evolutionary events. When modern humans interbred with Neanderthals in Europe and Asia between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago, they incorporated segments of Neanderthal DNA into their genomes. These segments can still be detected today because they have distinctive statistical properties. They show longer stretches of linked genetic variants than would be expected from normal human variation. And they exhibit patterns of mutation that indicate they diverged from the main human lineage hundreds of thousands of years ago. By analyzing these patterns, geneticists can identify which parts of modern human genomes came from archaic species, even when we have never found fossils of those species. Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman, researchers at the University of California, Los Angeles, applied this technique to West African populations in 2020. They analyzed genetic data from 405 individuals from Nigeria and Sierra Leone, looking for segments of DNA that showed the telltale signs of archaic introgression. What they found was shocking. Approximately 2 to 19% of the genetic ancestry in these populations came from an unknown source that had diverged from modern humans between 360,000 and 1 million years ago. This was not Neanderthal DNA, which has already been mapped and is largely absent from African populations. This was not Denisovan DNA, which is found primarily in Asian and Oceanian populations. This was something else entirely. The statistical analysis was rigorous and has been replicated by independent teams. The introgression was real. Somewhere in the deep past of West Africa, modern humans encountered another intelligent species and interbred with them extensively enough that their genetic legacy persists in millions of people today. The timing of this interbreeding is critical. The genetic data suggests it occurred between 40,000 and 100,000 years ago, long before the supposed Great Migration out of Africa. This means that Africa was not a genetically homogeneous starting point for human expansion. It was a complex landscape where multiple hominin species coexisted, interacted, and exchanged genes. The ghost population was not a small, isolated group. The amount of introgression detected suggests sustained contact over thousands of years, possibly multiple episodes of interbreeding across different regions. And the DNA that was incorporated was not neutral. Some of the introgress segments are located in parts of the genome that affect immune function, suggesting that interbreeding with the ghost population may have provided adaptive advantages to early humans, helping them survive diseases or environmental challenges specific to the African continent. This is not a minor footnote in human evolution. This is a major chapter that has been almost completely ignored. The response to the ghost population discovery reveals the deep biases embedded in how science approaches African research. When Neanderthal DNA was first discovered in European genomes in 2010, it was front-page news. The New York Times, The Guardian, National Geographic, and every major science publication ran stories celebrating the discovery. It spawned a cottage industry of research exploring the implications. Did Neanderthal genes make us smarter, more creative, more prone to certain diseases? Museums created elaborate exhibits. Documentaries dramatized the moment of first contact between modern humans and Neanderthals. The narrative was compelling. Our ancestors were not isolated. They were cosmopolitan, interacting with other intelligent species and incorporating the best of their genetic innovations. But when the same evidence emerged from Africa, the response was barely a whisper. The 2020 paper by Durvasula and Sankararaman was published in Science Advances, a reputable journal, but it received minimal media coverage. There were no museum exhibits, no documentaries, no popular science books exploring what it means that West Africans carry DNA from an unknown hominin species. The few articles that did cover the discovery buried it under technical jargon and failed to emphasize the revolutionary implications. Why the differential treatment? Because acknowledging a ghost population in Africa would undermine the Eurocentric narrative of human evolution that has dominated paleoanthropology for over a century. That narrative positions Africa as the simple origin point and Europe as the site of complexity and innovation. Neanderthal admixture fits this narrative because it adds complexity to European ancestry. Ghost population admixture threatens this narrative because it adds complexity to African ancestry, forcing science to admit that Africa is not the well-understood baseline, but a genetic mystery we have barely begun to investigate. The erasure extended beyond media coverage. Funding for follow-up research on the ghost population has been minimal. While Neanderthal genetics has attracted tens of millions of dollars in research grants, efforts to identify who the ghost population was, where they lived, and what happened to them have been chronically underfunded. No major expeditions have been launched to search for ghost population fossils in West Africa. No large-scale genomic studies have been conducted to map the full extent of ghost population DNA across African populations. The discovery was made, noted, and then largely abandoned. This is not how science is supposed to work. When you discover evidence of an entirely unknown intelligent species that interbred with human ancestors, that should trigger an explosion of research activity. The fact that it has not reveals that the lack of interest is deliberate. African genetics is not seen as sufficiently important or prestigious to merit the kind of intensive investigation that European and Asian genetics routinely receive. The genetic evidence for the ghost population is not speculative. It is based on the same rigorous statistical methods that identified Neanderthal and Denisovan admixture in non-African populations. When geneticists analyze a genome, they look for segments that are too divergent from the main human lineage to have arisen through normal mutation. These segments show patterns of linkage disequilibrium, where genetic variants are inherited together in blocks rather than being shuffled randomly through recombination. The presence of these blocks in modern genomes is mathematical proof of ancient interbreeding. The ghost population DNA shows exactly these patterns. Multiple independent studies, using different datasets and slightly different analytical methods, have now confirmed the presence of archaic introgression in West African genomes. This is not controversial among geneticists who work directly with the data. It is only controversial in terms of how much attention and resources it receives. The comparative analysis with Neanderthal research makes the bias undeniable. Since 2010, over 5,000 research papers have been published on Neanderthal genetics. We know what Neanderthals looked like, how they lived, what diseases they were susceptible to, and even some details about their social structures, all inferred from genetic analysis combined with fossil and archaeological evidence. In contrast, fewer than a dozen papers have been published specifically on the West African ghost population, and we know almost nothing about them. We do not know what they looked like. We do not know where exactly they lived. We do not even know if they represent one species or multiple species, because the genetic data is consistent with either possibility. This disparity is not due to lack of interesting findings. Every analysis of African genetics reveals new complexity. It is due to lack of investment. Science funds what it considers important, and apparently, understanding the deep genetic history of Africa is not considered important. Recent advances in ancient DNA extraction offer a potential pathway to finally identifying the ghost population, but only if resources are committed. Paleogeneticists have successfully extracted DNA from fossils over 400,000 years old in Eurasia, allowing direct comparison with modern genomes. Similar techniques could be applied to hominin fossils from Africa, but many such fossils sit unanalyzed in museum collections or remain undiscovered because excavation efforts are concentrated in Europe and Asia. In 2017, fossils of hominality were discovered in South Africa and dated to between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago, roughly the right time frame to potentially be related to the ghost population. But without genetic analysis, which requires both funding and permission from the countries where the fossils are located, we cannot know if there is a connection. The technology exists to solve this mystery. The genetic signatures point us toward when and where to look. What is missing is not capability, but will. The scientific establishment has not prioritized finding out who the ghost population was because it has not prioritized African evolutionary history as a field deserving the same resources as European evolutionary history. The implications extend beyond academic curiosity. The ghost population discovery proves that the out-of-Africa model, while correct in its basic outline, is far too simplistic. Africa was not a single homogeneous population that left to colonize the world. It was a complex landscape of multiple hominin species, some of which we have not yet identified, interacting across hundreds of thousands of years. Modern humans did not arise in isolation and then suddenly become capable of complex behavior when they left Africa. They arose in a rich evolutionary context, learning from and exchanging genes with other intelligent species within Africa, and then carried that complexity with them when they expanded into other continents. This reframes the entire narrative of human origins. Africa is not just the starting point. It is the site of the most complex and longest-running chapter of human evolution. And we have barely scratched the surface of understanding it because the resources and attention have been directed elsewhere. So let us return to the question we started with. Why has the discovery of a ghost population in West Africa evidence of interbreeding with an entirely unknown intelligent species, been met with such silence? Because it shatters the comfortable narrative that Africa is evolutionarily simple and well understood. It forces science to admit that we have been looking in the wrong places, asking the wrong questions, and funding the wrong research. The genetic complexity of the African continent is not a footnote to human evolution. It is the main story. Every discovery in African genetics reveals layers of complexity that rival or exceed what has been found anywhere else in the world. But those discoveries are treated as curiosities rather than as urgent scientific priorities because the institutional biases that have marginalized African research for over a century remain firmly in place. The ghost population is out there. Their DNA is in the genomes of millions of West Africans today. Their fossils are likely buried somewhere in the African landscape, waiting to be excavated. Their story, who they were, how they lived, what they looked like, and why they disappeared, is waiting to be told. But it will only be told if science commits the resources necessary to investigate. That means funding large-scale genomic studies across African populations. It means launching excavation projects in regions where the ghost population likely lived. It means training and supporting African scientists to lead this research rather than treating Africa as a place where Western researchers extract data and then leave. And most fundamentally, it means recognizing that the marginalization of African science is not an accident or an oversight. It is a choice. A choice to continue privileging European and Asian research questions while treating African mysteries as less worthy of investigation. Now that you know the truth, you can never look at human evolution the same way again. We are not the simple descendants of a single African population that left the continent and then diversified. We are the product of complex interactions between multiple intelligent species, some of which we have not even identified yet, playing out over hundreds of thousands of years across the most genetically diverse continent on Earth. The ghost population is not an anomaly. It is evidence that the real story of human origins is far stranger, far more complex, and far more African than we have ever been told. This is History Rewritten, where we uncover the genetic truths they buried to control the narrative. Subscribe, because the more we dig into our DNA, the more we realize that almost everything we were taught about where we come from was designed to keep Africa on the margins. And the truth is always more revolutionary than they want you to know.